Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jeanette Wright, I'm the State Librarian, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here to hear about the trouble with artist books. And to begin, I would like to pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land here at Kurilpa Point and their ancestors past and present. The State Library is very grateful to the Siganto Foundation, who through the Queensland Library Foundation has supported this seminar on artist books, and also who support the development of the collection through the Australian Library of Art Fellowship, this year awarded to Peter Anderson for research into Brisbane art in the 1980s, and for the artist books workshops, and for additions to the international artist book collection, some of which will be exhibited at Artspace Mackay from next week. Marie's long-term commitment to the arts in Queensland makes it a very special opportunity to thank Marie Siganto and the Siganto Foundation. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware that the Australian Library of Art, and particularly the Artist Book Collection, is one of our most significant collections here at the State Library. In our recently launched content strategy, it is identified as having a unique and special place. Our artist books are heavily used by school groups, universities, artists, and academics. And it's the largest collection in the country, and I guess we're one of the few organisations in Australia that can sustain this kind of professional support around artist books. So the seminar, The Trouble with Artist Books, is to reflect on the phenomenon of artist books in Australia over the past 2 decades, the reason for the boom and its legacy. This time frame coincides with the length of time that the State Library of Queensland has been actively collecting this art form. So our collection is the perfect vehicle through which to view the development of artist books in Australia. And the speakers have had a heavy involvement with artist books throughout this time. So we will begin our discussions today with Helen Cole, who is the librarian responsible for the Australian Library of Art and the artist books collections. And she's been involved for most of the time that the State Library's been collecting. And we'll have Noreen Grahame, who opened the Grahame Galleries and Editions in 1987. Noreen will be, she'll be speaking about the fine art prints and the artist books, which the gallery specialises in. So that's 26 years since the gallery was opened, and she's been involved with artist books. The other keynote speaker is Jan Davis, who's an artist bookmaker and an adjunct associate professor at Southern Cross University, following 20 years there as a lecturer. So I'd like you to make a big welcome to our speakers and to our audience. People have come today from across the state and across Australia to participate, and I want to thank you all for your interest and participation. I look forward to the talks and discussions because I have a lot to learn in this space, and we have afternoon tea here to fuel more discussion, and then I'd invite you to stay on and enjoy the launch of the book Hearsay by Susie Mudderman, from the director of Tweed River Art Gallery, which is a huge artist book by painter Ewan McLeod, printmaker Ron McBurney, and writer Lloyd Jones. So let's welcome our speakers.
Thanks, Jeanette. Good afternoon. I'm Helen Cole, the coordinator of the Australian Library of Art, which includes our artist book collection here at State Library of Queensland. I would like to add my thanks to the Siganto Foundation for their support of the Australian Library of Art in so many ways. It's a great pleasure to have Marie with us here today. I would also like to thank Jeanette for her support of the collection and our work with it. Just some housekeeping before we start. Could I please remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones and to use the back exit if you wish to leave during the talks. Bathrooms are located on level 3 at this end of the building. I can hear a rattling of phones everywhere. We are audio and video recording today's event for the SLQ website. If you have any concerns, please see one of the library staff. The program for this afternoon is that I and then Noreen and Jan will speak about our topic for today. Then Noreen and Jan will speak again about particular books that they are fond of. There will be time for questions and discussion following. Afternoon tea will then be served on the Queensland Terrace, which is outside at the front of the auditorium. During this time, some of the books discussed will be available here if you would like a closer look at them. At 4 p.m, we will return for the book launch of Hearsay. Now, the trouble with artist books from a librarian's perspective. When I sent the flyer for this session to a colleague in another library that collects artist books, his response was, "The trouble with artist books? Where do we begin?" And indeed, artist books present a number of challenges in their materiality, display, and the way they are understood. In every way, variability is their commonality. We can't even agree on a definition. It's the perennial question to which there is no definitive answer. We all love them, but we can't agree on what they are. We can't even agree on where the apostrophe should go. You will see that I have gone with the right way. Is this lack of a definition a disadvantage, or is it part of their appeal? The artist book collection at State Library of Queensland started out as a small number of deluxe edition books in our rare book collection. The donation in 1988 of the James Hardie Library of Australian Fine Art, a magnificent research collection that documented the visual arts in Australia, reinforced a significant focus on art in the State Library collection. There were around 20 artist books in the James Hardie Library, but they were not identified as such. There was no separate artist book collection, and they weren't catalogued as artist books, and it seems they had almost slipped in by accident. It was really Noreen Grahame who drew the library's attention to artist books following the opening of her gallery in Brisbane in 1987. Since then, the collection has grown enormously, currently comprising around 1,500 titles, mainly Australian, but also with a significant international component. This collection has been sourced from gallery exhibitions, art dealers, antiquarian book dealers, and direct from the artists themselves. Since I began working with the collection in 1993, the number of artist books available for purchase has risen exponentially. I'm not sure that the understanding of them has increased at a similar rate. Everyone who holds an opinion on artist books thinks theirs is the right one. The problem for public collection builders is that they must also have an opinion to which they hold when choosing works for the collection. It's seldom that the whole audience will agree with the position the library holds. This, of course, is an issue shared with art galleries, but libraries have a different collecting ethic to art galleries. While public art galleries present a deliberately selective view, libraries aim to provide an overview of knowledge, and this applies to artist books too. We try to present a broad picture of what an artist book can be, materially and conceptually. Livre de luxe, altered books, book objects, codexes, concertinas, tunnel books, books using paper making, photocopying, etching, or offset printing, political comment, conceptual works, or personal stories. However, like any public collection, we don't have unlimited funds, and so have to be selective about works going into the collection. Here at SLQ, we have a set of guidelines or questions that we use when selecting artist books for the collection. A fundamental question is, does this need to be a book? If it can exist just as successfully in another form, it's unlikely to make it into the collection. With some of the books offered for our consideration, I wonder if this is a question the artists have asked themselves. An example of this in reverse is Caitlin Sheedy's The 199, a book of 52 pages an unbound sequential drawing of a bus trip from West End to Brisbane City. It was framed, I must admit at my suggestion, for an exhibition at Redlands Art Gallery last year. Yet I found the result disappointing. This work needs to be a book. The gradual unfolding of the sequence emphasises the time the journey takes, the stages of the trip between the bus stops. Each page is a snapshot along the way. This is all lost when it is only seen in a single sweep. This leads to another of the troubles with artist books, exhibiting them. While unbound and concertina books and some book objects can be exhibited behind glass, visible in their entirety, traditional codex forms cannot. It is not feasible for artist books to be made available for personal handling in an exhibition where visitors number in the thousands or even the hundreds. The books would not survive. However, the most common complaint from an artist book show is, "I wanted to see the whole book." This can be overcome by the use of surrogates, these days most commonly a digital video or page-turning file. However, while providing a view of the content of the book, it does not allow interaction with all its elements: size, texture, surfaces, weight, and smell, the feel of the thing. While very useful for allowing access to a wide audience, particularly in Queensland with our vast distances, it is not a replacement for face-to-face connection with a book. With artist books, there always has to be a compromise. In the Tower of Babel, Anne-Marie Hunter made the compromise herself. She deliberately designed it to be a book form, in this case a scroll, that can be exhibited behind glass and viewable all at once. Another question asked of a book being considered for the collection regards how it is made. Is it sturdy and strong? Will it withstand the rigours of thousands of hands and who knows how many years? If it cannot, is that a part of the concept of that book? And if so, is it worth making allowances for it? For instance, Tanya Mishkin's Double Act is inserted in untreated vellum covers that are gradually decaying, reflecting the theme of decay in the play. Matt Dabrowski's Fish Book, Not Breathe a Word, is made from tiny dried fish and relies on the thousands of eyes looking up at the viewer to tell its story. Fish are not a normal part of library collections. Just ask our conservators. And a custom designed and fabricated Perspex box with oxygen absorbers had to be made for this one. Even straightforward codex can present challenges. Ron McBurney and Glenn O'Malley's Lights Out, about disappearing drive-in theatres, is a book of etchings on superfine paper laid over images on thick photographic paper. The combination of papers mean it is easily damaged. Yet we did acquire these books because we did think them worth making allowances for. The unorthodox shape and fragility of many artist books means that they have to be housed in individual boxes, often custom made. Their variable size means that they take up much more storage space than standard library collections. Cataloguing artist books is another challenge. Currently, most catalogue records for library books are copied from central databases, either commercial or library union catalogues. This represents a significant time and money saver for libraries. For most artist books, and for all unique books, this is not the case. They must be catalogued from scratch, a not inexpensive exercise. Another problem with artist books is the limits of the dedicated audience. Despite the surge in popularity over the past 20 years, even amongst art lovers, there are very few people who are aware of artist books as an independent art form. Most people assume you are referring to books about art or artists. A modicum of explanation, and they think about sketchbooks or artist journals. The concept of a book that does something other than provide information or literature is hard to grasp. As artist books are seldom shown in major art galleries, apart from big name shows like Picasso or Matisse, it is up to libraries to carry the baton. Our collection is viewed by thousands of people every year. Many of these are students at primary, secondary and tertiary levels. The majority of the remainder still are artist bookmakers. Artist books are variable by whatever definition we accept for them, in their exhibition, storage, conservation, cataloguing, and their audience. They are different from one another and often vastly different from other library collections. They present so many problems in the library context that it's easy to wonder why we bother to collect them at all. But here at State Library of Queensland, and a handful of other libraries, we do bother. And you are all here today to hear about them, and we thank you for that. That is a significant reason for us to bother. They also represent the latest development in books, the heart of the library for centuries, and may in time be the only physical books that continue to be created. And I am still here after 20 years with this collection, because every day working with artist books is a different and interesting day. Their variability, their biggest challenge, is also, I would argue, their biggest strength. Thank you. There you go. Oops, you're right now? Yep.
Oh, the lights are bright here. I'm Noreen Grahame, and I'm going to speak from the gallerist's perspective in this particular talk. But I'd like to a big thank you to the Siganto Foundation for supporting today's seminar, and to the State Librarian Janet Wright for the invitation to speak on a subject that has certainly brought out an audience this afternoon. Helen Cole has worked tirelessly to keep us in order for today's seminar. Thank you, Helen. In this first session, I'm speaking from the gallerist's perspective. The perspective may seem a little dry, but I wish to paint a picture of the Australian artist book scene over the last 30 years or so, how they are now in your face and are as popular as tattoos. How far they have come from what appeared to me to be a semi-underground movement when I opened Graeme Galleries and Editions. Our reaction to the question, what are artist books, has not kept pace and is still a defensive preamble about what they are not. We prefer to discuss the wandering apostrophe, which Helen has already mentioned, which allows us to skirt around casting a critical eye over an art form Johanna Drucker called the quintessential art form of the 20th century. My first trouble with this semi-underground movement was I had no idea who was making them. I had no idea if public institutions collected them, and if they did, which institutions. I also had no idea if a culture of private collecting existed. It didn't then, and it doesn't now. Catalogues from two important exhibitions turned up in searches for material at the State Library of Queensland. The first was from the 1978 Artist Books Bookworks exhibition of international and Australian artist books. 3 institutions were involved, and each was responsible for a section. The Institute of Modern Art in Brisbane selected works from the Los Angeles Institute of Contemporary Art. One-off, handmade bookworks from the Franklin Furnace were sourced by the Ewing and George Patton Foundation in Melbourne. And the Experimental Art Foundation in Adelaide was responsible for Australian bookworks. This catalogue section reads like a who's who of Australian artists. A quarter were female. Noel Sheridan, director of the Experimental Art Foundation, wrote the essay for the Australian section as well as the notes. One note reads, John Doe. This is the nom de plume of Gregory Ife, who must continue in a sense to remain anonymous. He gave me this book, which he had published himself in Adelaide, asking what I thought of it, but never returning to find out. I liked it, and if he reads this catalogue note, will he get in contact? The second catalogue, in print, Volume 1, Artist Books, accompanied an exhibition curated by Kay Campbell and Catherine Molan at the Power Gallery of Contemporary Art, Sydney, in 1987. Again, the material was international and Australian. Only one Australian woman artist, however, is represented. In her introduction, Campbell writes, "Certainly the revival of painting since the late 1970s has relegated many other kinds of production to the background, and in general, painting remains unthreatening to audiences and arts administrators. Nevertheless, purely practical aspects of exclusion should not be overlooked." The only reference book to cross my path was Gary Catalano's The Bandaged Image, published in 1983. Subtitled A Study of Australian Artists' Books, it discusses some 14 books against the background of the crisis in painting and the international activity surrounding these new productions. All the books are by male artists. Catalano redresses his gender bias somewhat in the appendix, in which he mentions 3 women artists and their books. These artists are Mickey Allen, Bonita Ali, and Bea Maddock. This image shows the gallery's files of Australian publications on the subject from the period 1978 to 1990, quite a long period, and supports my statement that artist books were a semi-underground movement. But underground movements are the most interesting. In 1988, I mounted the gallery's first exhibition to include artist books, some little frottage books and a larger artist book by Madonna Staunton, and Normanna White's A Sort of Diary were included. Normanna made only 2 copies of her diary. One went to the State Library of Queensland and the second to the National Library of Australia. All Madonna's little frottage books sold, one to the State Library and the larger book to a private client. Well, something had gelled, a sellout show of artist books. On reflection, this result could have been due to the dearth of availability of this type of material at this time. Commercial galleries famously avoid the field. But results are results, so I commenced plans for a big exhibition of artist books. The show was opened in 1991, accompanied by the gallery's first catalogue, cheekily titled Artist Books, The Catalogue, published in a standard and a limited edition version. Another exhibition followed in 93, but by then the mushrooming had started. More artists were making books and, of course, wanting to show them. Again, in the main, commercial galleries avoided them. At a pinch, their exhibitions may include a few books by artists in their stable. So the idea of an artist's books fair raised its head and took hold. The first in 1994 was followed by another 4. But in my mind, the first was the most exciting. The librarians in the James Hardie Library greeted the idea with enthusiasm. Margaret Rutherford, Director of Special Collections, offered the State Library as a venue, a decision sealed by the then State Librarian Des Stevens. The fair was set up on the covered forecourt outside what is now the Children's Corner and held over 2 days. We had to dismantle it on the first evening and reinstall the next morning. All the James Hardie librarians and other staff and artists gave up their weekend to help. It never could have taken place without this support. The artist books fairs, through necessity, were democratic, open to all. Through my association with university printmaking departments, some booked tables in the first fair, and this became tradition. Between fairs, my gallery's exhibition program of artist books continued. However, the books coming my way were not provoking excitement. Many made no statement, many were merely pretty, and many were mimicking the traditional livre d'artiste. A challenge was needed. In 2007, I invited artists to submit books for a themed exhibition, Lessons in History, Volume 1. This was followed up last year by Lessons in History, Volume 2, Democracy. Excitement had returned. With so much activity a new publication on the genre was needed. It came in 2008 from the National Gallery of Australia. Australian Artist Books is a survey by Alex Silenich of artist books from the National Gallery of Australia's collection. A Gordon Darling Fellowship afforded him 6 weeks in the works on paper storage rooms at the National Gallery of Australia, or as he once described it to me, 6 weeks in a heaven where trolleys of artist books were wheeled out for me to peruse. The book is divided into 2 sections: the essays in the main section, 4 approaches to artist books, attempt to see the books by each artist as something related to their general art practice. The artists are Ian Byrne, Robert Jacks, Bea Maddock, and Mike Parr. Silenich unpacks just 16 books from the trolleys for the second section, selected artist books. In an email, he explained that the 16 books were selected to give an idea of the range of work in the collection, the different kinds of books, and to write them up as a kind of unfolding experience in time, reporting the various events of opening that book and the provocations that this caused. Silenich also wrote that he did not realise he was writing a book. He thought the text would go on the website or maybe be put into the gallery magazine. He is still amazed by the wonderful book that came out of the experience. Recent catalogues show that exhibitions are orientating towards themes. The State Library of Queensland led the way in 2005 with Suffrance Women's Artist Books. Graeme Galleries and Editions followed with Lessons in History Volume 1 in 2007. Recycled Library Recycled Library Altered Books was published in 2009 for an exhibition from Art Space Mackay, which travelled to over 10 venues. Monica Oppen published a massive catalogue to accompany an equally massive exhibition, The Silent Scream, Political and Social Comment in Books by Artists. This is the most ambitious exhibition catalogue to be published in this country on the subject of artist books. And lastly, the more modest catalogue from Graeme Galleries and Editions for Lessons in History Volume 2, Democracy. These are all must-be-read, must-have publications. From early on, the Print Council of Australia recognised and supported activities surrounding artist books. Over half of the 1999 winter issue of the PCA's quarterly journal Imprint was dedicated to 5 articles on artist books. And I hope everybody here is a member of the PCA. If not, Jan and I can help you. Artist Books Awards have also mushroomed. The Fremantle Print Prize led the way in 1994. In the first couple of years, artist books were in a separate section, and eventually they were taken into the main prize. The Libris Awards at Art Space Mackay commenced in 2006 with the intention of holding them every 2 years, in conjunction with the now defunct Focus on Artist Books program. The 2012 award was deferred to this year and has a main prize of $10,000 for a single book. The only university to mount an award is Southern Cross University, Lismore. It staged its first award in 2005, and to date, 6 have been held. The 7th is scheduled for 2014. Eileen Thurgood, the director of East Gippsland Art Gallery, explained that their award, Books Beyond Words, have been held every 2 years since 2009. Even though it has proved to be their hardest undertaking, it has nevertheless been the best thing that has happened, as the gallery experiences difficulty attracting contemporary art exhibitions down to East Gippsland. Manly Library in Sydney received a generous grant to hold their first award in 2011. The acquisition funding for the second award, held in March this year, came from artists' entry fees plus a little top-up. Publications on the subject have been keeping pace with the proliferation of books since the early 90s. Once again, the files from 78 to 90, and now the files from 78 to 2012. So you can see it has been growing Who is now collecting? If public galleries ever considered seriously collecting the quintessential 20th century art form, they have all but abandoned the field to the few collecting libraries. Galleries realise that libraries have picked up this mantle. Galleries do collect books, but usually only those books by artists already represented in their collections. The exception is the National Gallery of Australia, which actively collects this material. Roger Butler, curator of Australian prints and drawings, considers them part and parcel of making images. The number of libraries collecting artist books has not expanded, and neither have their budgets. They are being overwhelmed by the continuous flow of books being presented, overwhelmed too by the elevated prices. They are feeling the pressure of the hordes at the door. As far as private collections go, there are only 2 private collections I know of, but 2 do not make a culture. Now the artists' books are as popular as tattoos with artists. The question must be raised, are the awards and other activities raising artists' expectations that their books will meet with success, that they will enter public and or private collections? Let's face it, most do not. But what to do? I think we just have to hang out the shingle. Artist books here. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm obviously Jan Davis. It's fantastic to be here. It's fantastic to see so many of you here. Thank you to the State Library for the invitation to speak. Getting ahead of myself. I'd also like to thank Helen Cole at the State Library of Queensland and 2 librarians from the Southern Cross University Library, Libby Powell and Anne Bannerman, who responded to my request to look at even more books. And I'm also grateful they allowed me to photograph works in their collections. Now to the artist's perspective. What do I know about the reasons behind the mushrooming that Noreen speaks about? I think that part of the answer, not the whole answer, but part of the answer is that printmakers got their hands on books and they took them into Australian art schools. There's an associated reason, but I hope that will become clear as I proceed, but I'll mention it explicitly at the end. Gary Catalano, in that reference book Noreen mentions, notes that most of the early artists in this country, most of the early artist books produced in this country were produced at a time when painting appeared to be in crisis. The book format provided an alternative space for artists which satisfied their needs in a way that painting at the time appeared not to. This, of course, was during the rise of conceptual or post-object art. Catalano writes particularly about the rubber stamp works of Robert Jacks, made between 1973 and 1982. Beautiful works. Catalano also includes Action Man's Story, 1976, by Sydney painter Ian Howard. The work is a confronting anti-war work relating one man's experience of war in 72 scenes. Were the first signs of something else at play, something not addressed by Catalano? Some of those painters turned to printmaking when they made their books. Recently, I interviewed 3 colleagues of mine who make books and who taught bookmaking as part of their printmaking programs. Milan from the University of Tasmania, Normanna White from the University of Southern Queensland, and Stephen Spurrier, who followed Normanna at Toowoomba. I asked them how they came to bookmaking and how they taught bookmaking to their students. Milan's engagement with books is perhaps the most enduring. Unable to speak English when he commenced school, picture books were a refuge for him. He made little books of his own, 7 or 8 pages taped together, pictures of his favourite things, and he'd carry these around with him and become lost in his own secret book world as an escape from the reality of the alienation of the schoolyard. But Milan encountered books by artists relatively early in his own career as an artist, remembering seeing Tom Phillips, a humorment, which you'll see later, while he was still a student, and later when Milan was a printer at Landfall Press in Chicago in 1977, he worked on other artists' books. An early work of Milan's, Burning Issues 1996, is constructed from the pages of a Boys' Own annual and followed his exhibition of the same name, held at Grahame Galleries the previous year. The cover of the book carries an image laser printed onto canvas, wrapped around hard covers and secured with brass rivets. This book combines low-tech stencil printing with the emergent technology of the digital printer into a cohesive production. Each book in the edition of 6 is slightly different because the found pages intervene differently with the overlaid stencil and inkjet prints. The book was part of a series of works made in response to the war in the Balkans, a conflict which Milan, as a child of a Yugoslav father, felt intensely. Milan has always considered himself an artist storyteller, and to enable complex stories to be told in chapters, he often makes a set or sequence of words. This is a detail of that, of works, sorry. When developing ideas, Milan often taped images together, just like he's done as a child, testing different sequences. His books were sometimes visual thinking prior to making other works, or sometimes a summary of a resolved sequence, as is the case in this work, Bird Tree Frieze. Installed, Bird Tree Frieze stretches over 3 metres in length. In a book, the same images can be held in one hand. The images set in the same sequence. The book Concertina Bound in a fixed cover takes on an object form, almost bird-like. Milan's philosophy of art as storytelling permeated his teaching at the University of Tasmania, and many of his students produced books. He stresses that he taught books to students primarily as a means to convey their ideas. He was far less interested in the craft of binding and such things. For Normanna White, artist books emerged from her exploration of alternative exhibition practices and spaces. Following from a sense of frustration with and lack of respect for the mainstream gallery system, she began to make postcards in the 1970s. She'd been mailing her postcards to artists and other colleagues and to family and friends for a few years, before she was invited in 1978 to show the postcards at the Art Gallery of South Australia. The cards were installed in pairs on the wall, like pages of a codex book, showing the images on one side and the text on the reverse of each postcard. But White cites a publication that she first saw in 1978 and revisited in 96 at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London as an important influence on her future bookmaking. Cuisine by H.J. Laroche, published in 1935 and illustrated with original lithographs and aquatints, was a cookbook. To convince me of the qualities of this text, Normanna showed me her notebook from 96. It contained carefully made drawings and diagrams indicating the typeface and font size, the colour, the layout, the title page, the illustration pages. Her diagrams showed the importance of white space to the overall design of the cookbook. There was a drawing of the slipcase and the cover of the book, and how the cover had been varnished and it looked like brown kitchen paper. Cuisine simmered in her mind for 10 years before she produced her first artist book, a sort of diary, made in 1987 and shown at Powell Street Gallery in Melbourne the same year. A sort of diary uses a ring binder format of 60 pages, comprised of screen prints on handmade recycled paper. The book was made as a gesture of thanks to the people Normanna had recently worked with at Peacock Printmakers in Aberdeen. It used portraits shot at a railway station photo booth, along with photographs of her colleagues, photocopied and enlarged to encourage image degeneration before being reproduced as screen prints. Normanna's second artist book, Jam Doughnuts, Fragments of Foreign Food, was made in an edition of 6 in 1989 and is another example of the slow ferment of an idea. 2 recipe books nestled in the one box. One she describes as the full time life type production, the other a kitchen version of the recipes for cooking with. Jam Doughnuts used colour separations made a decade previously and put aside when the idea proved too expensive to execute. The colour separations were finally photocopied, then collaged, drawn and written upon, and photographed again to make the image stencils. Normanna's bookmaking was a solution to her desire to find exhibition spaces that were not dependent on the institutionalised gallery system, and her ambition to produce work that had an everyday existence. Her engagement with various processes, including mechanical image makers like photocopiers, identified her as a printmaker searching for new ways to extend the medium of printmaking. She remembers showing her first books to students to provide them with inspiration in their own work. Both Michael Schlitz and Jonathan C., she recalls, later used postcards and books as part of their practice. This is not a book. This is a fridge magnet. Stephen Spurrier tells me that the major impetus for his involvement with artist books occurred in 1996, when, from his base in Melbourne, he visited James Cook University in Townsville to work for 10 long weeks with Ron McBurney. He documented his visit in a number of sketchbooks, each becoming like a chronological narrative of his Queensland experience. And on the return drive to Melbourne, he pulled in and visited the Artist Books and Multiples Fair 96 in Brisbane. The books he saw there suggested possibilities of developing his sequential sketchbooks. And back in his Melbourne studio, those sketchbooks evolved into simple concertina books of 8 to 10 pages. The best known of these books is the Art Can Damage Your Brain series. Stephen describes these books as being knocked up from whatever was at hand. 2 years later, Stephen left Melbourne and moved to Toowoomba for the teaching position, left vacant there in printmaking at the University of Southern Queensland. His resourcefulness and his curiosity about finding new ways to work led him to form close working relationships with the university's service areas, as he calls it. He entered into an innovative collaborative arrangement with the media and publicity departments and the university printery, which enabled him to produce a number of colour photocopy and offset works that would not have been possible had he been working independently. His practice of accessing high-end resources where he can and combining these with resourcefulness has produced fine works such as The Book of First Aid and How Not to Use It. A work using layered colour photocopies bound inside a digitally printed cover, then printed and perfect bound at the university printery. The university service areas enabled works such as this to be produced in editions of 100. Concurrently, though, Stephen was maintaining his now hallmark make-do practice. Ugboot Press was born from a clever quip delivered while Stephen was standing on a pile of covers, gluing buckram to card and musing on a name for his press. Stephen continues to make books. His recent Strangers in the Garden suite examines the darker aspects of the garden and what might go on during both night and day. Quasi-religious ceremonies, witches' rituals, voodoo rites, or strange demonic activities. Stephen believes in pushing himself and his students into new territory in order to keep his teaching fresh and interesting for him, to himself and to his students. His aim, he says, is to teach his students the resourcefulness to practice at the highest level out of the boot of their car. So, in conclusion, reflecting on the work and teaching of Milan, Normanna and Stephen, I'm proposing two possible reasons, part reasons, for the proliferation of artist books. The first one, that printmakers got their hands on books. Books were such a good fit for studios, for printmaking studios, which had an emphasis on understanding the nature of multiples, of sequences, of the heritage of text and image, of printmaking as a medium that incorporated emerging technologies. The teaching emphasis was on ideas and how to make a book respond to a concept, rather than being on bookmaking as an art itself. And the second reason that I foreshadowed at the beginning of my session, the other reason for the proliferation, I think, or for that part reason, was the advent of digital technologies which made the making of books far quicker and easier to undertake. Because today artist books are conceived and produced with extraordinary speed. The news of their creation disseminated to artist book networks around the globe, and I've got to have a metaphor as well, more quickly than the spread of an infectious virus. Thank you very much.
Well, it looks as if you can't get rid of me that easily. Well, my second little talk is about books that succeed. There were so many books we could have chosen and so many we had chosen, but they fell by the wayside, time's wayside. Jan made reference in her talk, The Artist's Perspective, to a humorment by London artist Tom Phillips. And even though we're discussing the Australian scene, a humorment is the perfect example of how far an artist's book can be pushed. It is the only artist's book that is widely available. An app can now be downloaded to iPhones and iPads. It is 46 years since Tom Phillips chanced on and paid 3p for a 19th century Victorian potboiler, a human document by William Hurrell Mallock. By the 1980s, he had, in his words, mined some dozen copies of the original book to produce art. Towards the end of 1966, Phillips started work. He was inspired by William Burroughs' cut-up method of writing. Burroughs, in his turn, had been influenced by his friend Brian Gysin, who invented the cut-up technique and who said that writing was 50 years behind painting. At first, Phillips used pen and ink to score out text he did not want, but painting in acrylic gouache soon replaced this. The title of the new book was chanced upon when Phillips folded one page back and a humorment appeared out of a human document. He worked on the unique version from 66 to 70. Box sets of limited edition screen-printed pages were released in the early 70s. In a talk at the State Library of Queensland organised by Cassie Doyle, Nicholas Zerbrugg spoke on visual poetry. His talk was around the time of the 1989 Visual Poetics exhibition he curated at James Baker's Museum of Contemporary Art in Brisbane. By the way, another catalogue that's a must-have, must-read. Always generous, Zerbrugg had brought along a small port, bursting with stuff, a TARDIS really. Stuff kept coming out until the table was full. Amongst this stuff were some of those screen-printed humorment pages. Phillips regarded the unique book and the limited edition sets as elitist. In 1973, Thames and Hudson published a humorment as a trade book, and it's not been out of print since. In Phillips' word, it was a democratic reproduction. The 5th edition, revised and with 80 additional new pages, was released last year. 2 further versions were published by Editions Hans-Jörg Meyer, Trailer in 1971 and The Heart of a Humorment in 1985. In an interview with Vincent Katz in the Print Collector's newsletter in 1984, Phillips stated, "Since it risked being a folly, I ought to do it as a sideline, but sidelines shift towards the centre. A humorment did shift to the centre and became the centre of a cult." Ron McBurney first published his flip book, Tangi, in 1996. Handmade in an edition of 30 copies, it was finished in time for the second Artist Books and Multiples Fair in the same year. McBurney took a colour photograph of his friend, Glenn O'Malley, and proceeded to manipulate it. On some pages, the right eye has been exchanged with the left eye. The poking tongue makes a complete circle around the face, and by the end of the circle becomes detached and is ejected into space. Tangi fits neatly into the palm of the hand, ready for flipping. I don't know if the prospect of producing a larger edition by hand proved too daunting, but in 2001, McBurney republished Tangi as a trade book in an edition of 1,000. Perhaps he had taken a leaf out of Phillips' book, so to speak, and wanted a more democratically available Tangi. The black cover and slightly smaller width are the only revisions. The second edition, published by Ned of the North Productions, one of McBurney's many publishing arms. I spied this next book, A Survey of Vomitus in 16th Century German Woodcuts, on the Queensland College of Arts table at the 3rd Artist Books and Multiples Fair in 1998, and could not resist getting it for the centre of the artist book collection. Fiona Fraser, the artist, made a small edition of 6. She was at that time a student at Griffith University, Queensland College of Art. The cover is some sort of bubbled fabric stained a suspicious yellow. The marbled end papers mimic those used in 16th century books, with some hand colouring to emphasise the yellow theme. Rubber stamped letters spell out the title and the artist's name on the title page. The images are taken from 16th century woodcuts and copied onto parchment-like paper. The woodcuts reveal the social norms of the time, namely revellers' bulimic behaviour. Like the originals, the copies are black and white, but Fraser has coloured the vomitus lime green. The woodcuts were not originally published together or even at the same time, but by assembling them in one book, the outcome of this tongue-in-cheek student's view is a success. Romance in producing a book that succeeds has the last word. Michael Schlitz, working on a block for the Nature of Things artist book outside his hut in a Tasmanian forest. The wood Michael used for the engravings is Tasmanian native olive, a wood used by furniture and musical instrument makers and by Michael. The dense grain, although harder than boxwood, is ideal for engraving. Michael made and hand-printed 10 wood engravings, wrote and screen-printed the accompanying text for The Nature of Things, published in 2005 in an edition of 10 by Graeme Galleries and Editions, Numero Uno Publications, and bound by Fred Polman. The wood engravings are printed in black ink and face the accompanying text across the gutter. On the facing page, Schlitz uses a pale yellow screen print to screen print the title and white for the body text, almost invisible. He's demanding our involvement as reader, viewer of each mini-story. We become captivated. The text accompanying the image on the screen reads, Antipodean's Atlas. Gravity is a heavy condition. Ideas can be heavy. The world is heavy, but it can be lifted quite easily. This film shows Michael cutting one of the blocks for the book. It's all romance. This is when we do realise that they're not all knocked up quickly. We don't have sound on, but sometimes he says things like, and so as he's working through. These were just a couple of books that we selected for books that can succeed, but there could have been many, many more. Thank you.
this is the part I've been waiting for. 5 books that I love. And like Noreen, this was a very hard choice. I probably had 15 I wanted to speak about. There just wasn't the time. In my first love, the sensibilities of the printmaker are paramount. It's Beer Maddox's Artefacts from Trommermina, a 1990 work made in an edition of 25, and I think available here to see today. Not. Edition of 25, it's held in the Southern Cross University Library as well as here at the State Library. B bound the edition herself in a Japanese-style binding using a textile cover. Exquisite Japanese paper forms the folded back pages, each adorned with fine paper decal at the lower edge and interleaved with the most delicate tissue. The individual pages are studies or portraits of the artefacts. A selection of these artefacts, in fact probably all of these artefacts that Maddox worked with here and now occupy the lower niches of another major work by Maddox held here at the Queensland Art Gallery. Trommermina, Forgive Us Our Trespass, 1988 to 89. This is just one panel of the 4. The relationship between the 2 works is one of the reasons that I do love, and I chose this particular book. There are 48 artefacts in the book, each scrutinised and painstakingly traced onto etching plates, each accompanied by the description of the artefact's traditional function and its physical form. Each plate then etched, inked and printed, with delicate monoprinting adding the colour. While reading Maddox's work, one circumnavigates the artefact, physically turning the book to read, like turning the artefact in one's hand. And by so doing, one rehearses, as noted by Selenich in his book, Australian Artist Books, that Noreen spoke about, one rehearses really a later work by Maddox, the breathtaking Terra Spiritus with a darker shade of pale, held in the collection here of the Queensland Art Gallery. And for those living in Melbourne or going to Melbourne, it's currently on show at the National Gallery of Victoria as well. On 52 sheets, the work measures almost 40 metres when fully installed. It is an incised drawing of the entire coastline of Tasmania, worked with hand-ground local ochre over letterpress and finished with hand-drawn script. The island of Tasmania, scrutinised by Maddox, just as she had scrutinised each artefact for this book. In my judgment, Artefacts from Trommermina is a superb example of a monumental concept held preciously intimate in the confines of a book. My second love is by Noel McKenna. This book bears his hallmark binding method, soft card cover, covered in paper, and then folded in a plastic cover, applied just as we covered our school books years ago. 6 Horses is made with cheap, readily available materials and tools: yellow paper, black paper, a pair of scissors, a photocopier, a stapler for binding. When I asked Noel why 6 Horses was a book rather than, say, a drawing, he responded, "Because it looks good." Then I knew it was a silly question. For many years now, McKenna has painted enclosures, birds in cages, people in houses, or horses contained in fields. His compositions, poetic renditions of psychological spaces or locations. I love all his books, but I chose 6 Horses in particular because of the way it creates space within the book. I really fancied the idea of the horse disappearing into the gutter of the book, like slipping through a gateway or strolling behind one of McKenna's buildings. Here McKenna uses the potential of the page, and it's something that I hold dear about artist books, realising that the top or the bottom, the sides or the gutter all have a different sort of power to work with, and he uses this to generate space in the same way that he generates space by the compositions in his paintings and drawings. I responded to the immediacy of the making, the speed and directness of capturing an idea, the simple charm, and as anyone who knows me, to the pony in it. My third love, is a one-off book. There's no edition of this one. A good book in theory. Made by painter and wordsmith John Smith, it's held in the Southern Cross University collection. It's hand-drawn in a Moleskine diary. A good book in theory is an ironic reference to a publication of the same name about writing research theses. John's plays on words have been a feature of his work for many years, manifesting as titles to exhibitions or to individual works, or through the effaced text present in his paintings. He describes his interest in the carnivalesque inversion of upturning hierarchies of meaning as a kind of grammatica jocosa, or laughing grammar. Terms like standing under knowledge and the look of something to say are poetic displacements, not as simple as irony, saying one thing and meaning another, but more complex, working in a poetic way on a number of levels. He says, like an alphabet of dust and numbers. Why do I love this book? I respond, of course, to the clever irony of it. But in the end, I had to admit that the big part of my attraction to it is its relationship to the unconscious doodles that many of us make. And in fact, John is a great doodler and has used it as a device to get through many a tedious university research meeting. I like the fact that it's a book that's midway between a drawing and a text. My fourth love is Ron McBurney's The Book of 100 Kisses, 10 Licks and 1 Love Bite, made in 1993. I'm getting heavily into the love theme now. This book could be described as a private bodily performance. The artist has inked his mouth, a profound printmaker's statement, and has had his passionate way with the book. The semi-transparent pages allowing the heat of the moment to become, to an extent, an accumulated experience. Ron suggests that all his books are an idea perhaps he's heard Helen say this, that he thought would work best in a book form. And therefore, most books don't really relate stylistically one to the next because they're always driven by the idea. The Book of 100 Kisses, 10 Licks and 1 Love Bite is the most intimate example of an artist book that I know. And it's a book in that theme of accumulation of objects, a serialised collection, a fetishised obsession. Ron notes that this book is in a distant way related to Ed Ruscha's book, 9 Swimming Pools and a Broken Glass. The broken glass in Ruscha's is the single love bite in McBurney's. And I examined each page and I finally thought I found it, the love bite on the final page. But I was so excited I couldn't hold the camera still, and I apologise. It's out of focus, I'm sorry, and I'll talk to Ron later about whether that is in fact the love bite. Ron's encounter with the book was obviously a pleasurable experience, for it exists in an edition of 3. My last love is a love poem. And today, with the artist's permission, I dedicate it to artist books themselves. Ever so slowly, a love poem by Richard Tipping. It's a tiny work. A folded envelope forms that cover, the fibrous paper pages stapled within. It's handwritten like a love letter. I want to read it to you, a love letter to Artist Books. Feeling you ever so slowly, brush, push, spaces between our lips, shared breathing, pulling my tongue into, sweetly curve, these feelings lap, hardly knowing who, touching, touches, hugging, hugged, our eyes lost, blue, our, us, this instant, enduring affection. You give me back myself as I give you, you. Thank you.
Thank you to Jan and Noreen for their perspectives on our topic for today. Now we have a goodly amount of time for questions or discussion either. Just because we're recording, if you have a question, could you just wait for one of the girls to bring the microphone up to you so that everybody can hear it and it can be recorded properly. So, anyone like to start? Anne.
That was marvellous. Is this on?
Yes. Yep.
I wanted to ask about, in the collection that you're involved with, Helen, does it include the moving text in any way? Because there's quite, in the last few years, of course, there's been quite a noticeable increase in work that could be called electronic concrete poetry or leading to artists' books. And I just wanted to see whether, in fact, that is a trajectory that the library might work towards within the division that you work.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly one that we're going to have to deal with eventually, and we have had a few problems with it. We do have one video work in the collection that includes music. We have quite a few books that include CDs that have a music or a spoken word component. We have tried a couple of times to collect, if you call it that, books that are on the internet, artist books that have been done on some sort of internet platform. And the way that we would go about that is by using the National Library's Pandora internet archiving programming. And that's a problem with artist books online because they're done on so many different platforms that are really hard to archive. So the answer is we're not really doing it yet, but we inevitably will be. Yeah.
Just to follow that, does that mean to say that you need to replicate for your own platform such works?
Yes, we do. Yes, and sometimes they use they have embedded software that just can't be downloaded. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
And even one book that we commissioned for the freestyle exhibition that we had here in 2008, we commissioned it especially for that exhibition. We don't have it anymore because the platform has ceased to exist.
Ephemera.
Sorry?
Ephemera.
Yes, digital ephemera is just another one we're struggling with at the moment. Yes. Any other questions?
It's only a little question. Are digital books a big component of what's happening, or not really? Is it still paper? And the second question, just to throw another one in, is how does the State Library find out who's making artist books? What mechanisms do you use?
As far as digital books, I think it's still reasonably small, but Jan and Noreen might disagree with me.
I guess I'm not sure whether the question's asking about books that exist only in the digital realm or whether they're
that's what it is, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yes.
only in the digital realm. They're around, but I think the vast majority of works are still works on paper or similar materials.
Or fish.
Or fish. Analogue. And the second question?
The other question about how we find out about books, we keep our peepers out. We follow up exhibitions, online notifications of exhibitions as well as physical exhibitions. And a lot of artists bring their books directly to us.
And I think the other thing that's worth adding there is that Helen is terrific. And when Southern Cross University Artist Book Prizes were on, I mean, Helen was driving that 400k basically to look at books and come back. So Helen's out and about, and I know Helen's judging, can I say that? The Mackay Artist Book Prize. So she'll get a chance to see another 70 works or so there.
Yeah, that's very true. I do keep an eye on those things, and they are a very good source for our collection. And of course, Noreen shows as well. Oh, sorry.
Gail Phillips. Now that Google have digitised many of the famous books of the past, and we're relying even more on digital versions of scientific journals and so on, do you think that the artist's book is going to be the only book available in future times, that is the way, the artist's book is the book of the future?
I think that's a definite possibility, yeah. But at the same time, even though Google's digitising the world, there are still people, as well as our artist book collection, of course, the Australian Library of Art includes our history and art of the book collection. So we have books going back to the 15th century and pages from even earlier than that. And people still want to see those things in the flesh. So even though they might be able to look at them on Google, doesn't mean that they necessarily want to look at them only on Google.
Perhaps I could comment on that too. It's Jeanette Wright here. I'd like to say that I think in terms of the book, I think that what you define as a book is a very wide category. And I think many of us are now beginning to see the book as a conceptual entity, and it can be a book in an electronic form, it can be a book in a physical form. And you might be right that artist books will eventually be one of the few remaining physical forms of books, but there will be books of all kinds, books electronic and books, artist books, but books that people create for all kinds of reasons. And I don't think we should be pessimistic about that. I think because there's a lot of electronic forms being created doesn't mean the end of the book as such.
So we'll move on from not being able to define an artist's book to not being able to define a book. Great, another quandary. Yep. Anne?
Yeah, just a funny observation, but I'd like to hear your comments on it. Could you think that artist books might be one of the few arts where there are more practitioners than an audience?
Then what? More practitioners than audience.
I think it's
No.
Oh, Noreen thinks not?
No, I don't think there's more practitioners than audience. The problem is the practitioners are the audience, so maybe it's got a status quo. No, that's not true. No, if and I'm sure Helen will confirm this, if you have an exhibition of artist books, or at least when I have an exhibition of artist books at the gallery, I'm exhausted because so many people come and they stay and they want to discuss. So, and they're not always artist bookmakers. There's quite a lot of people who are just interested, but they do stay a long time. And that was something Eileen Thurgood from East Gippsland Art Gallery said, that it's the best thing that's happened to their gallery. People visit. I'm from Brisbane, and I thought East Gippsland was just up the road from Melbourne, but apparently they have difficulty in getting exhibitions of contemporary art to East Gippsland. When she said that, I was astounded. But and the artist book award that they do is the best thing that's happened to them. They don't actually have a collection. The only ones they collect are from the prize for an East Gippsland artist, and that's only because they don't have space. They'd love to collect, because people visit from far and wide, and they stay at least 45 minutes in the gallery when they come. So I hope that answers your question.
The other comments?
Well, I think, the circles that I move in, there are artists who are making books and who love books and who collect other people's books. And I'm actually really struggling to think of people who collect books who are not artists, because it's something that Stephen told me as well, that in one of his teaching strategies was to encourage his students to make little chapbooks. And part of the whole project was that these would be exchanged around the class at the end of it. And he was specifically encouraging that idea of collecting and of swapping and of exchange, and that whole sort of process. He was using books to establish that process that artists love to do between themselves, to exchange work. And so they're actually all makers as well as lovers of books. Yeah, good question.
From our point of view, apart from the school, university groups that come in, probably the largest number of our audience are artist bookmakers. And actually, I'd really be interested if we could have a show of hands of how many people are actually artist bookmakers here today.
Yeah. Only half.
It's actually less than I thought it might be, so that's really interesting.
The proposition that artist bookmakers are their own audience, and there isn't much of an external group that has an interest.
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the points that Noreen and I were making, that it's because they're not visible in the large art galleries. It's hard to get a wider audience knowledgeable about them. Yes. But at the same time, there's always been good roll-ups for the book fairs.
About that last topic. Does that fit in the realm of the zines?
We're taking that definition wider and wider. I think it's fairly similar, actually. Yeah, I think if anything, maybe zine makers are even more cloistered than artist bookmakers.
I'm not so sure that that's true. I think zine makers, there's possibly more zine makers around amongst younger people than there are sort of more. They're more comfortable making zines, which are quickly made and cheaply made, and and the sort of thing, a bit like the chapbooks that Stephen was talking about. They can be.
But now they are becoming expensive.
Now they are becoming expensive.
They've turned that corner of being a zine into, I don't know what it would be, a little gap between artist books and zines. They're sort of somehow encroaching upon that. They're getting more elaborate, more expensive. So I think there's sort of there's a blurring at the edges of that whole.
It's certainly
whole production.
Another question that we have to deal with. Does this go into the zine collection or the artist book collection?
Yeah.
I would very much like to, just changing the topic slightly, in relation to sculptural artist books, and I'd like to invite your observations, all of you, on the process of what artists actually say in relation to the process of taking a two-dimensional image that they've drawn, they've planned, and creating the three-dimensional sculptural form. Have they made comments about whether it consolidates their ideas, or is it a launching, is it a platform, or is it an interface for both?
I think a number of artists who are very interested in the concept of a book. They're interested in the inherent qualities that make a book a book. And so many of them choose to abstract that into a sculptural form. I'm reminded of a book that went into the Southern Cross collection that was an altered book, that was an existing book, and it was stuffed full of that sort of builder's foam. It's stuff that just extrudes out. And, the young student was talking about, the book as a receptacle for knowledge and the pouring forth of knowledge from a book. And the book became, quite a challenge on the library shelves. But I personally, and I didn't show any images today, but I personally find those sort of the conceptual extension of the notion of what a book is to be a really interesting thing, as much as I love the books I've shown here that are works on paper. So I think they sit quite comfortably there. They're just more of a nightmare for the people sitting over here.
And a pleasure.
Yes, thank you.
Well, you showed one,
Yes.
Anne-Marie Hunter's book.
Yes. And also the Kurt Schranz's Book of Oceans,
Yes.
which we will have out here during the break. Yep, Adele?
I think Sue partly asked my question just then. I noted that there was no mention of sculptural books, and of course that's something very dear to my heart. Mm-hmm. Where does the sculptural book or book object fit into the scene? Is there a separate definition for it? I've been told sometimes that what I do, oh no, that's not an artist's book because it doesn't have 7 ticks on the scale. That's a book object. I'd be really interested to know what the panel's opinion is on this, collectively, individually. I'm not going to change what I do to make it fit into a particular category, but I'm fascinated to hear where the sculptural book actually fits into the scene.
I think it's just another one of those problems with the definition. Some people would say it's not an artist book. We would certainly consider them artist books, and Adele Outridge's works are included in our collection, including several of her very sculptural works, and they sit very happily with all our other books. So certainly sculptural books, book objects, they all come within our definition of an artist book. Although I didn't show any of your books, but again, that Kurt Schranzer is a book object, very sculptural. So
It's interesting, just some of the discussions that I've heard with people like Johanna Drucker, etc., they seem to put the sculptural book or the book object into a separate category. It's very... it's good to know that the State Library of Queensland obviously includes the book object within the definition of artist book. It's just something that I've found interesting to get variations of opinion on it. So,
Adele, you'll have to show me the little scale. I didn't know there was one. Maybe I just sit in my gallery too long. I don't have any problems with sculptural books. I don't know if I picked one to show today, but we had so many books, Jan and I, we divided them up and we had to curtail what we were showing. A lot of them fell by the wayside because we just didn't have time. Otherwise we'd be here till tomorrow. But no, I don't have any problems with sculptural books.
With video art and performance art becoming so much part of the milieu of conventional artists, does the image of somebody like Mike Parr sucking on multiple pieces of paper, does that now constitute a book?
Could do if Mike Parr says it is a book. Yes. We'd really like to see the performance of Ron kissing his book.
But, in all seriousness, there's a fine edge between these art forms. And Noreen spoke about the sort of underground nature of it. And, it's all the time. People are experimenting, and performance is, in conjunction with books, is part of what artists are doing. So
you can't hold artists down. If you think you can, they've already broken away. And there's like that horse in the Six Horses. He's gone through the gutter of the book.
In fact, we're thinking, very early thinking, for our next seminar, that we might do performance books. So if anyone's got any suggestions on books they'd like to see performed, that'd be...
performed and read. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I think we've probably only got time for maybe one more question.
As a past curator of an artist book program, I would just like to comment firstly on Adele's question, the place of a sculptural book. I found that we actually had quite a big exhibition of artist books every year, and it's the sculptural books which actually gave the whole exhibition enormous balance, beauty and diversity, and particularly some of the much bigger works like Wim de Vos's book, and particularly Adele's works have just made the exhibitions really just really beautiful to view as a whole exhibition. And just commenting on performing books, we also had Corey Wright doing a performing book, and it's all these different ways of tackling the book sort of makes it so exciting for, I think, for an exhibition.
Okay. Tim?
We're running over time. We kept it.
Today, and we all know where that might lead, but that's not where I want to go. I would like to ask, and Joanna Drucker raised it, gatekeepers carry a big responsibility, and I think that it's a fair enough ask that gatekeepers give a clear indication of what their definitions are. Mm-hmm. And we understand working definitions change. And I'm just wondering if you three would be willing to give a simple description of what sort of books you find clearly or obviously artist books. Something simple, not definitive.
Well, I thought that what we showed today, and that's why we selected the books we selected, was to answer this question.
Yes, think to get my view of the library, of artist books, look at the library's collection. And it's very broad.
I think in preparing for today, I reread many of the reference texts on artist books that have been published over the years, Drucker's books and Philpott and that wonderful book, the Dutch book. And I think I can't go past if an artist puts it forward as a book. I have to agree. And just going back to the book object issue, I think it's some of those book objects that bring that sort of really critical or intellectual edge to the debate. And I think for that reason that they're really important.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop. We're going to have to stop there, unfortunately, because afternoon tea awaits out on the terrace. But thank you very much for attending so far. We can certainly continue the discussion out there, and we'll be back in here. There will be some books from the collection for viewing in here. Otherwise, we'll be back at 4 o'clock for the launch of Hearsay. Thank you. Well done, boys.